Hello, and welcome to the place where we talk about the idols on the hill. I'm Phil, your host. This is going to be the last of our introductory videos. In the last video, we looked back into history and learned from the great Hebrew leader Joshua about the importance of values, choices, and the battle for the hearts of mankind. In this video, we're going to make some important connections as we learn about statues, stuff, and the idols on the hill. We learn that Joshua told his countrymen, "Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." For the people of Joshua's generation, it seemed right to follow his advice. Sadly, after Joshua's death, his noble words were often forgotten. The scriptures tell us that later generations fell into worship of the other gods on numerous occasions. This created a series of cycles. You can read about the early history of the Hebrew people in the Bible, in the books of Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and finally 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In the cycles that we talked about, one generation would be faithful to God. The next would be disobedient. Disobedience made the Israelites vulnerable to attack and subjugation from their neighbors. After allowing them to experience the results of their faithlessness for a period of time, God raised up righteous leaders to help the people overcome their oppressors. A period of spiritual renewal followed. But sadly, the cycle would start again only a few years later with a new period of rebellion. This cycle was repeated over and over again. Spiritual renewal and zeal for God was replaced by eventual deterioration into disobedience. At the lowest points in the cycles, shrines to other gods were found on every high hill and under every spreading tree. When godly leaders took over and led Israel into a high point in the cycle, the other gods were shown the exit. As you read these histories, though, there is one group of gods that usually survived these times of revival. A very curious group. These were the idols on the high places. The first otherwise good king to gain the dubious distinction of falling short in this area was named Joash. Let's read about him. Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years Jehoiada the priest instructed him. The high places, however, were not removed. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. A number of other Hebrew kings behaved the same way. Something was difficult about the high places which allowed them to become entrenched. Perhaps it was their number. As we mentioned earlier, in the worst of times they were on every high hill. Now, perhaps it was their location. The term high places doesn't always refer to physical height, but there were times when these places were high up and far away. Maybe the worshippers of the other gods would decide to fight for their deities. If that was the case, hilltops and mountains provide a big defensive advantage. To this day, mountainous terrains make the most confident of soldiers sober and the most advanced of armies careful. Taking out all the high places by force could be a costly and potentially risky venture. Or perhaps it was the fact that they were hidden from the eyes of those down in the more developed regions. It's easy to pretend that some things don't exist when you can't see them. Whatever the reason, many times spiritual revival stopped at the city's edge. Taking down the small idols wasn't hard, but the idols on the high places, they were difficult. When you read these stories, you find yourself asking over and over, will there come a time when someone is courageous enough to remove the high places? When will someone throw down the idols on the hills? That's where our series gets its name. A few kings were brave enough to take on the task, but sadly, most weren't. The spiritual cycles of ancient Israel are more than interesting tidbits of history. They're an important chapter in an epic tale older than mankind. One way of understanding human history is to look at it as a competition spanning millennia. The one true God, the God who created human beings, continually reaches out to them in love. Sometimes humans respond well, offering him their service and devotion, but at other times they run away. And when they run to idols. Those idols have competed with the one true God in a cosmic conflict that has vied for the hearts of humankind from our earliest days. Sometimes the competition is quiet, sometimes it's explosive. As I look at the moral problems in America and other places around the world today, I believe we have the same problem Israel had thousands of years ago. The problem can best be summed up in the word idolatry, or service to the other gods. That may seem strange to many modern viewers. To most, idolatry conjures up images of statues in textbooks and museums. Before they made it to the museum, though, those statues were something important to the people who made them, something to be given a great deal of attention, something thought to be alive. Sometimes their worshippers carried the statues into monumental battles. Sometimes they received sacrifices of the most precious things available in their day, including human lives. But back to the modern viewer. Isn't idolatry something that happens in other places and in other times? We go to the museum and we see the old relics, and we leave. Nothing follows us out. We read the Bible and we see other gods in the pages of the Old Testament. But wasn't all of that written thousands of years ago? Idolatry doesn't happen here and now in the Western world, does it? And if it does, isn't it limited to little cult groups that don't really influence the general population? Well, here's another important connection. To understand this problem, you need to remember two words that we learned in our first video: statues and stuff. You see, idolatry has two parts. The first is the symbol, or the statue. The symbol was thought to represent a living entity. The second part is the reason people served the entity. If you served the entity, it gave you things, or so the servants thought. So there was the statue, and then there was the stuff it gave you. In modern times, most Westerners look down on worshiping statues. Even as far back as the time of Jesus, there were lots of people who figured out that serving statues was a bad idea. But they still liked what the followers of the statues claimed the statue would provide. This led Jesus to teach this important concept. He said, "No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Here, Jesus makes an important connection. Previously, people might have defined idolatry as worshiping before a statue. Now, Jesus connects idolatry with money. So at this point, we have a new definition. Idolatry occurs anytime someone gives more devotion to an earthly thing than they give to God. Later, the Apostle Paul made the same connection when he wrote, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry." As we've said, the idea of connections is vitally important. In each age, from the beginning of human history to the present, people have needed to see the connections between the idols of their day and the world in which they lived. When they saw those connections, they could choose how they would respond. In ancient Israel, the connections were obvious. Idolatry meant following gods with names like Baal, Ashtaroth, Dagon, and Molech. Centuries later, the Romans were pushing their gods with names like Mars, Venus, and Jupiter. At that time, though, Jesus and his followers encouraged people to look for more abstract connections. Centuries after that, great reformers like John Calvin would point out connections to idolatry in their age. And now we come to the present. We have to skip a lot of centuries and a lot of good people to get here. One of the purposes of this series is to identify these connections for people who live in the 21st century. Now, why are we doing all this? Well, a little about me. I had the privilege of studying something called pastoral counseling at Westminster Seminary in the early 1990s. Westminster is a fine school in the Reformed tradition of Christianity, so its graduates are well versed in the thinking of people like John Calvin. The instructors in the counseling school did something that influenced me deeply. They identified important connections between modern idolatry and the human mind. I found the principles that I learned there to be very helpful to me personally, as well as for lots of other people. Once I had learned to think about the concept of idolatry, though, I began to look at the world around me differently, and I began to see a larger pattern. I began to see connections between idolatry and Western history, particularly the history of America. For example, earlier we asked the question, how did America change from a nation of pilgrims to what it is today? Most people, as we said, ask that question in a rhetorical fashion, as though the answer is inexplicable. In fact, the answer is very obvious. There is no mystery at all. You can look through American history and see very clear examples of the American people making choices. Good choices and bad choices. Choices to follow the one true God, and choices to follow idols. And the results of those choices explain quite well why we are the country we are today. You see, the forces that were at work thousands of years ago in Bible times are the same forces that motivate people today. One of the things we'll do in this series is meet some of the gods who have influenced history from Bible times through the modern age, and we'll see how they've done their dirty work. As we meet each one, we'll learn ways of fighting back. We'll learn to see the connections that we need to see. As we end our introduction, you may find yourself asking, is it really possible to enjoy God? The answer is a loud yes. We'll show you how to do it. But what about our modern world? As we developed our ideas, we've looked around and seen some serious issues. A deteriorating society, children who have never even heard about God. Is there anything we can do? Again, the answer is a loud yes. In order to do these things, we must make connections. We must understand values, choices, and the battle for the hearts of mankind. With these things in mind, let's enter the battlefield and take on some idols. Once again, if you're watching on YouTube, you can hit that subscribe button. Or you can like us on Facebook. And you can visit our website, www.idolsonthehill.com. We'll look forward to seeing you next time when we talk about the idols on the hill.